In late February 1915, T.S. Eliot wrote to Conrad Aikin from Oxford, weighing up his plans for the future. The letter marks something of a turning point in Eliot's life. Having just received word that he has been renominated for a fellowship back at Harvard, he wonders whether he should return to academic life in the States or move to London and seek employment. Neither option is remotely appealing, with Eliot expressing dread at the prospect of either returning to the nausea of factory whistles and the college bell, or of remaining in the suffocating atmosphere of wartime England with its execrable food and climate. Yet clearly he feels under pressure to choose, writing dejectedly, "I suppose I shall be forced to a decision in a few days." What's striking about the letter is where Eliot's thoughts drift as he struggles to make up his mind. After signing off affectionately to his old friend, he added the following remarks to the bottom of the page. "The idea of a submarine world of clear green light. One would be attached to a rock and swayed in two directions. Would one be happiest or most wretched at the turn of the tide?" The separation of these lines from the main body of the text marks the transition that has taken place from real-world concerns to a more consoling state of fantasy. Amid this undersea realm, Eliot imagines himself to be a kind of seaweed anchored beneath the waves with a root-like structure known as a holdfast. Here, his position remains uncertain, and yet there's something graceful in this image of wavering. Rather than being torn apart by the sensation of being pulled in two directions, he simply moves with the flow, swaying back and forth with the rhythm of the turning tide. The idea of a submarine world allows Eliot to transform his sense of being bound by circumstances into a more enabling condition. Here he finds a kind of peace in the idea of being attached and swayed, rooted but flowing, mobile yet firmly held. Though the passage is describing a physical movement, Eliot's final question, "Would one be happiest or most wretched?" suggests that he may desire to be moved in a different sense. To be attached and swayed is to exist in a state of emotional dependence, remaining connected to and under the influence of someone or something else. The word attachment derives from the Latin attacciare, which means to bind someone or something legally, as well as the Old French attachement, which describes the sentiment that binds two people together. As the sociologist Antoine Hennion notes, quote, "Attachment signifies a connection, restriction, restraint, and dependence, reminding us that we are prisoners, confined on all sides by our history and our environment." It is not what we would expect to find in the work of a writer renowned for his emotional and critical distance, who would even pride himself in a 1919 letter to his mother on remaining, quote, "isolated and detached." This might explain why Eliot's vision of attachment appears at the bottom of the letter, like a sort of submerged footnote, and why he avoids possessive and personal pronouns in favour of more abstract statements, such as "the idea," "one would," as though keeping this possibility at arm's length. Taking this passage as a starting point, I want to suggest that it reveals an important undercurrent at work in Eliot's writing, a submarine subtext, if you will. Here and elsewhere, images of marine life, particularly creatures that grip and cling on to their surroundings, tend to surface in Eliot's work in connection with his thinking about the surprising virtues of the attached condition. From early on in his writing career, Eliot was captivated by images of marine life, finding himself, quote, "moved by fancies that are curled around these images and cling." From the ragged claws of ancient crustaceans in early poems such as Prufrock, to the delicate algae and the sea anemone that cling to the lines of the dry salvages, Eliot's writing is full of creatures whose instinct is to hold on tight while the sea tosses them about. As I hope to show in this talk, Eliot's engagement with marine life, from his study of crabs and other submarine critters in biological texts, to his literal or littoral encounters with sea creatures on the Massachusetts coastline, helped him to imagine a version of artistic selfhood that is not compromised by its emotional dependence on others or on other forms of life, and is instead strengthened by its affective ties. So a quick sort of outline of this talk. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about Eliot's reputation as a poet of detachment and how his marine imagery seems to complicate this in interesting ways, I think at least. I'll then move on to talk a bit in the second section about Eliot's reading about marine life in biological texts and how this feeds into his early poetry. And then finally, I'll take a look at Eliot's later writing and think about how the presence of marine life seems to allow access to certain depths of feeling, as he puts it, that would otherwise go untapped. So, section 1. Eliot might not seem like the obvious candidate with which to explore the dynamics of attachment. After all, the author is renowned for his intellectual detachment, a stance most famously articulated in his essay Tradition and the Individual Talent, where he insists on the separation between, quote, the man who suffers and the mind which creates. In this essay, he likens the mind of the poet to a catalyst that remains unaffected by the chemical reaction it produces, acting on the material it holds while not being acted on by it, remaining, in short, unswayed, unmoved to states of either happiness or wretchedness. In a 1917 letter to Mary Hutchinson, however, Eliot expresses his theory of impersonality in slightly different terms. I like to feel that a writer is perfectly cool and detached regarding other people's feelings or his own, like a god who has got beyond them, or a person who has dived very deep and comes up holding firmly some hitherto unseen submarine creature. But this sort of cold detachment is so very rare. At first glance, this somewhat chilly passage is typical of what we have come to expect from Eliot. The hints of omniscience in Like a God, coupled with the scientific disinterest of the diver, exemplify the kind of cold detachment that we tend to associate with his critical writing. On closer inspection, however, the passage is couched in strangely emotional terms. I like to feel. And in the final moments, Eliot appears to backtrack from his initial position. But this sort of cold detachment is so very rare. Crucially, moreover, in the effort to convey a perfectly detached outlook, Eliot reaches for an image that looks a lot like its opposite. The submarine creature may have been torn away from the depths in which it resides, but it is now firmly attached to the person who comes up holding it. The tactile force of this analogy might cause us to wonder whether this creature may be equipped with a firm grip of its own, calling to mind the unsettling Cnidarian presence that stretches out its tentacles in Prufrock's Pervigilium, which is a cancelled sort of middle passage from the poem. It also recalls Eliot's description in a late essay of the unknown, dark, psychic material that looms up from the depths of the unconscious mind, the octopus or angel with which the poet struggles. So this earlier account of impersonality may help to focus our attention on something that has remained hitherto unseen in Eliot's writing, and which his marine imagery helps to bring into view. Namely, that Eliot's aesthetics of detachment is met with a countervailing impulse towards attachment. But what do we mean when we speak of attachment? The term is commonly associated with the work of the mid-20th century developmental psychologists John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, the former is seen here on the right, who use it to describe the close emotional bond between an infant and its primary caregiver that provides support and protection in early life. Drawing on the work of ethological and evolutionary theorists, Bowlby and Ainsworth argue that the attachment between parent and child is both biologically useful in that it ensures the survival of the offspring, and thus the species, and psychologically beneficial, in that it provides a feeling of safety, a secure base, as Ainsworth puts it, from which the infant can explore. This affective bond is central to the infant's emotional development, laying the foundations of their personality and providing the blueprint for all subsequent relationships. Attachment, writes Bowlby, is the hub around which a person's life revolves, not only when he is an infant or toddler, but through his adolescence and his years of maturity and into old age. Bowlby and Ainsworth's theory of attachment was influenced by the work of Sigmund Freud, who emphasised the importance of the parent-child bond to the formation of the ego. In 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, Freud proposed that the infant develops a powerful libidinal tie to its mother during breastfeeding. All love relations, he writes, are on the model of, and a continuation of, their relation as sucklings to their nursing mother. Freud would develop this idea further in his later essay, Civilization and Its Discontents, arguing that the infant at the breast experiences an oceanic feeling, a feeling of an indissoluble connection of belonging inseparably to the external world as a whole. Freud's account of oceanic feeling is key because it suggests that the sensation of being attached to and dependent on someone else is paradoxically liberating, granting the subject a feeling of connectedness to the external world as a whole. This early stage in ego feeling, Freud notes, only lasts for as long as the infant does not distinguish his or her ego from the external world as the source of the sensations flowing in. Originally, the ego includes everything. Later, it detaches itself from the external world. The ego feeling we are aware of now is thus only a shrunken vestige of a far more extensive feeling, a feeling which embraced the universe and expressed an inseparable connection of the ego with the external world. Oceanic feeling comes of being unable to ascertain where the self ends and the world begins, undermining the efforts of the ego to keep itself sharply outlined and delimited. Yet Freud describes this dissolution of boundaries in surprisingly positive terms, likening it to the exhilarating feeling of being in love, in which, against all of the evidence of the senses, the man in love declares that he and his beloved are one, and is prepared to behave as if it were a fact. Significantly, moreover, Freud suggests that the adult psyche cannot banish this primary ego feeling from itself entirely. Instead, it coexists like a sort of counterpart with the narrower and more sharply demarcated ego feeling of maturity. Oceanic feeling, then, describes a curious psychic phenomenon in which vestiges of an original or originary feeling of connectedness survive beneath the development of the self as an autonomous entity. Freud's account of oceanic feeling is consistent with the residual status of attachment in Eliot's writing, which coexists alongside a more sharply demarcated aesthetic of detachment. There is, however, little evidence to suggest that Eliot's thinking about attachment was directly influenced by Freud, and as many of you will already be aware, Eliot's attitude towards psychoanalysis was far from all-embracing, referring to it as, quote, a dubious and contentious branch of science, and accusing Freud of verbal vagueness and an inability to reason. Nonetheless, Freud's description of oceanic feeling resonates with Eliot's exploration of attachment as a kind of submerged psychological feature that clings to the underside of the modern subject's autonomous self-image. At one point, Freud surmises that the survival of oceanic feeling in the adult psyche might strike readers as curious. Why, he wonders, should such a primitive type of feeling be preserved alongside the transformations that have developed out of it? And yet, as he goes on to explain, where animals are concerned, we hold the view that the most highly developed have arisen from the lowest, yet we might still find all the simple forms alive today. The great saurians are extinct and have made way for the mammals, but a typical representative of them the crocodile is still living among us. Freud's sense of oceanic feeling as a kind of evolutionary throwback, an earlier, less developed state of being, helps to account for the connection between Eliot's thinking about attachment and his interest in simple forms of marine life. So, part 2. Like Freud, Eliot was influenced by evolutionary biology, in which, as Robert Crawford notes, humanity was linked continually to the life of lower organisms. Many of the theorists of biological adaptation that Eliot was reading about in 1916, including Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, Charles Darwin, and August Weismann, developed their most significant evolutionary theories from the study of marine invertebrates, which were thought by many to hold the key to the origins of life. Darwin's The Descent of Man, which Eliot owned and annotated, concludes that humankind's earliest ancestor must have been an aquatic animal, more like the larvae of the existing marine ascidians, or sea squirts, than any other known form. In his copy of Darwin's The Descent of Man, Eliot has marked out a section in the text detailing the sexual characteristics of a kind of crab. Certain species of Melita are distinguished from all other amphipods by the females having the coxal lamellae of the penultimate pair of feet produced into hook-like processes, of which the males lay hold with the hands of the first pair. The development of these hook-like processes has probably followed from those females which were the most securely held during the act of reproduction, having left the largest number of offspring. The crab's union is undoubtedly marked by violence, with the phrase, "the males lay hold," recalling an earlier definition of attachment, to seize physically with hands, claws, etc. Yet it is possible to detect a more positive image of attachment in the sentence that follows, with Darwin describing how the most productive unions between the Melita crabs are those in which the females are most securely held during reproduction. Holding on tight and being securely held is here presented as a generative activity. The firmer the grip, the greater the chance of survival. Eliot may have been drawn to Darwin's account of these hook-like processes because it describes a mechanism that he saw as lacking in modern relationships. The subjects of his early poetry frequently lament their inability to form secure attachments to others, and the absence of these emotional bonds is often expressed as a kind of prehensile weakness, not to mention sexual sterility. We see this in the wasted limbs of lonely figures such as Prufrock, how his arms and legs are thin, who find solace in the memory of enveloping female arms which wrap about a shawl. "I should have been a pair of ragged claws," reflects Prufrock wistfully, after recalling the succession of female arms, braceleted and white and bare. Claws worn ragged, perhaps, through use. As Paul Fussell notes, Eliot's early poetry is full of interrupted, abortive, or vacant gestures by withered, blue-nailed, phthisic hands with feebly clutching fingers. With this loss of physical purchase comes an inability to anchor oneself in the world or to form lasting bonds with others. Eliot's subjects would love to lay hold on the females, but instead their words and actions are slippery, their movements unstable, like the rust that encrusts the broken spring in Rhapsody on a Windy Night. They can only cling to the form that the strength has left. Eliot's interest in the attachment devices of marine organisms is further suggested by his reading of the British-Irish marine biologist Ernest McBride's study of heredity. McBride's study outlines recent research on inherited characteristics in sea creatures such as barnacles, sea urchins, and shore crabs. Reviewing the text in the International Journal of Ethics in 1918, Eliot wrote of its exceptional importance and he quoted McBride's main conclusion, seen here, in full. Exercise of the functions tends to enlarge the organs by which these functions are carried out, and this exercise continued through generations slowly modifies the structure of the stock, till eventually the resulting change can show itself in the young before the exercise has begun. Conversely, persistent disuse of function tends slowly to atrophy the organs by which they are carried on, till eventually these organs are only developed in a reduced form. McBride is promoting a Lamarckian theory of inheritance, which adheres to the basic principle, use it or lose it. And ironically, as Donald Childs points out, this was already something of an outdated concept at the time that Eliot was writing, having fallen into disuse in the late 19th century as a result of Weissmann's germplasm theory. But McBride's reappraisal of this concept may have been of symbolic use to Eliot, due to its emphasis on the privations involved in evolutionary development. At one point, McBride states that the development of new functions often occurs at the expense of existing ones, arguing that evolution always involves, quote, the loss of something characteristic of the species from which the new strain derived. This perspective may help to shed light on the waning powers of prehension exhibited by the subjects of Eliot's early poems, as well as in his interest in the hook-like processes of Darwin's crustaceans. Seemingly for Eliot, the lasting presence of these attachment devices in marine organisms calls attention to their slow atrophy in humans, surviving in his writing only in a reduced or shrunken form in the images of withered hands and clutching fingers. McBride's study also contains an intriguing line of argument about the restoration of certain valuable features in an organism. Describing a recent experiment on a type of crustacean, which when placed in artificial conditions produced offspring with deformed carapaces, McBride notes that this mutation ceased to occur when these abnormal individuals were returned to their natural habitat, explaining, if the original environment be restored, then the nature of the groups circulating in the blood, which the hereditary substance attaches to itself, will become again what it was before, and this will tend to undo the effects of the former environmental change. So here, the restoration of prior environmental conditions results in a productive evolutionary reversion, a return to form. It's important not to gloss over the disturbing implications of McBride's application of theories of biological heredity to human populations, nor to overlook Eliot's tacit endorsement of his troubling views. McBride's study of heredity was published in the Eugenics Review, the journal of the Galton Institute, which sought to improve the genetic quality of the human population with recourse to biological theories of heredity and natural selection. Yet while McBride's study is typical of the eugenic misuse of biological knowledge to further an agenda that is rooted in white supremacist ideology, it also helps to account for Eliot's representation of the sea in his early writing, at least, as an original environment, capable of undoing the injurious effects of modernity and of restoring certain valuable features to the individual. So we see this in the way that the feeble gestures of figures such as Prufrock are held in opposition to the firm grip exhibited by submarine creatures, whose surprising tenacity becomes a source of envy for wary human subjects. In Rhapsody on a Windy Night, a lone speaker stalks that's one way of characterising him. A lone speaker stalks the nighttime streets, contemplating a series of female figures that remain out of reach in distant doorways and shuttered rooms. Into this grim reality, with all its clear relations, its divisions and precisions, come waves of recollection resembling small, twisted things brought in on the tides of memory. I have seen eyes in the street trying to peer through lighted shutters, and a crab one afternoon in a pool, an old crab with barnacles on his back, gripped the end of a stick which I held him. In the figure of the crab, Eliot presents a double image of prehension. The claws grip the stick, the barnacles grip the shell. The speaker's act of holding appears somewhat weak by comparison, a dynamic that stems from the proximity of the word held to the stronger verb gripped, as well as from the unusual syntax of the passage, which relegates the human subject to a kind of subclause, pun intended. Indeed, there's something decidedly odd about the phrase, which I held him, that appears to stem from the absence of a preposition, perhaps, such as with which I held him, or which I held out to him. Eliot's omission of this element elides the relation between speaker and crab, resulting in an uncertain dynamic of attachment. Just who is holding who here? Reading this passage alongside the author's annotation of Darwin's most securely held crabs, the ambiguity of the phrase, which I held him, could be interpreted, by me at least, as a partially submerged desire to be held by the crab, though the speaker initiates contact with the stick, a surrogate attachment of sorts. It is he who is gripped by its hook-like processes. Even without the Darwinian and Freudian sexual subtext, the image appears somewhat erotically charged. In contrast to the failed moments of human contact that surround it, this moment of connection with this crab is perhaps the closest that Eliot's speaker gets to physical and emotional, perhaps, intimacy. So, in his early poetry, images of marine life suggest a capacity to form emotional attachments to self and to things and to persons that is lacking in human subjects, though which may stand a chance of being regained. Yet in Eliot's later writing, the presence of marine life suggests an awareness not only of what has been lost to the human subject over the course of their development, but also of the emotional attachments that have held on. Part 3. In the autumn of 1932, Eliot returned to the United States for the first time since 1915 to take up the Charles Eliot Norton Professorship at Harvard. In the months that followed, he delivered a series of lectures under the title The Use of Poetry and the Use of Criticism, which, as the title suggests, sets out to examine the use of poetry and criticism, what it does or ought to do. The lectures did not achieve the prominence of his earlier critical essays, with earlier reviewers finding them dull, pedantic, and unilluminating. Eliot initially seemed to share this assessment, confessing to a friend shortly afterwards that the lectures contained nothing new and were not prepared, quote, under the most favourable of circumstances. Returning to this material in later years, however, Eliot discovered that his perspective had changed. In a preface to the 1964 edition of the lectures, he writes, quote, "After rereading them twice, I found to my surprise that I was still prepared to accept them as a statement of my critical position," adding that he hoped that these lectures may be taken instead of tradition and the individual talent by some anthologist of the future. Eliot did not specify which part of the lectures would be best selected, but I think we can gain an important sense of his critical position and how it differs from his earlier stance from the following passage, which occurs midway through the fourth lecture on Wordsworth and Coleridge. It's quite a long passage, but I'll try and read it fairly quickly. Coleridge's taste at one period of life led him first to read voraciously in a certain type of book, and then to select and store up certain kinds of imagery from those books. And I should say that the mind of any poet would be magnetised in its own way to select automatically in his reading, from picture papers and cheap novels, indeed, as well as serious books, the material, an image, a phrase, a word, which may be of use to him later. And this selection probably runs through the whole of his sensitive life. There might be the experience of a child of 10, a small boy peering through seawater in a rock pool and finding a sea anemone for the first time. The simple experience, not so simple for an exceptional child, as it looks, might lie dormant in his mind for 20 years and reappear transformed in some verse context, charged with great imaginative pressure. In the image of the sea anemone, we might recall Eliot's analogy of the diver emerging from the depths, holding firmly some hitherto unseen submarine creature, as well as the memory of the crab gripping the stick in Rhapsody. Yet here it is far more unclear who or what is doing the holding. Though the initial activity of peering and finding is attributed to the child, by the end of the passage it is the material rather than the mind that plays the active role. While his earlier analogy of the diver ends in failure, Eliot now seems to be suggesting that being bound to certain images is highly productive, with this material becoming charged over time with great imaginative pressure. Although he makes some attempt to distance himself from this anecdote, referring to himself obliquely as a child of 10, a small boy, Eliot is likely recalling an encounter from his early childhood summers spent on the coast at Cape Ann in Massachusetts, where he collected specimens of seaweed and peered into rock pools, and where, as Lyndall Gordon notes, his imagination fastened too on the still pool and the light-filled water. At the time that he wrote the lecture, Eliot was the closest that he had been to the shoreline of his youth since 1915, so that's about 20 years or so, and he evidently felt the pull of the sea during his visit, as can be seen here in this brilliant photo of Eliot in a bathing suit with his colleague Ted Spencer, and they're at the edge of the Massachusetts coastline, surrounded by tangles of seaweed. Yet while the memory of the sea anemone may be in keeping with Eliot's surroundings, it also seems strangely out of place here. The sudden upsurge of this personal material in the middle of an academic lecture appears incongruous, not least because it throws up an image of Eliot seldom seen as a small boy. The appearance of the sea anemone makes sense, though, if we take this simple experience to be a kind of oceanic feeling that resurfaces from time to time in both Eliot's critical writing and his poetry. As Christopher Ricks has noted, Eliot revisited this early encounter with the sea anemone again and again over the course of his writing. So it first appeared in his doctoral dissertation on F.H. Bradley nearly 20 years ago, where Eliot uses it to illustrate how the mind attaches concepts to objects in the surrounding world. The sea anemone, which accepts or rejects a proffered morsel, is thereby relating an idea to the sea anemone's world. The creature would later resurface in Murder at the Cathedral, when the chorus imagine themselves circling back through earlier stages of life. I have lain on the floor of the sea and breathed with the breathing of the sea anemone. As well as in the Dry Salvages, where it features alongside the more delicate algae in a coastal pool. What was it about the sea anemone that so stuck with Eliot? Ricks suggests that it was the creature's intuition of digestion which tentacularly caught Eliot, arguing that the sea anemone's alimentary processes, so its acceptance and rejection of proffered morsels, resonated with Eliot's impression of how the imagination selects and digests memory into art. The concept of digestion is pertinent to Eliot's understanding of how the poetic mind can be sustained for long periods by the same material, as well as how it is energized by its encounters with non-human life. Yet it also implies a form of mastery. To digest an object is to break it down so that it can be absorbed by the body. The object gets used up in the process. My sense is that Eliot's encounter with the sea anemone retains its hold over him as something that his mind cannot fully metabolize, functioning instead as a kind of sticking point in his imagination that gains an effective charge by virtue of its refusal to submit to the workings of the intellect. Eliot's reflection on his attachment to certain kinds of imagery is part of a deeper consideration about how poetry, or poetic thinking, can help us to regain access to a feeling of indissoluble connectedness with the surrounding world. The persistence of such primitive types of images, as Freud refers to them, suggests a failure to fully detach and wrest oneself free of an early stage of ego feeling, and yet for Eliot, the mind of the poet is sustained by these lingering attachments. In the concluding lecture in the series, he wonders, why, for all of us, out of all that we have seen, heard, felt in a lifetime, do certain images recur, charged with emotion, rather than others? the song of one bird, the leap of one fish at a particular place and time. Such memories have symbolic value, but of what we cannot tell, for they come to represent the depths of feeling into which we cannot peer. The memory of the sea anemone resurfaces implicitly here in Eliot's image of peering into the depths, as well as his repetition of the verb charged. Here too, Eliot seems to be suggesting that such images gain symbolic value by virtue of their resistance to critical interpretation. Because they cannot be detached and held firmly by the mind, they accrue emotional significance, gaining a powerful, affective charge that can be channeled into verse, and granting the poet access to depths of feeling that would otherwise remain out of reach. The process of affective accretion at work here is reminiscent of a behaviour exhibited by another sessile creature that Eliot may have peered at in the still pools of Cape Ann, the oyster, which gets a bit of grit in its shell, can't get rid of it, and builds up a pearl around it. Eliot would even draw this comparison in his notes to the concluding lecture of the use of poetry, quoting fellow poet A.E. Housman in confirmation of his own experience. I think that the production of poetry, he writes, in its first stage, is less an active than a passive and involuntary process. And if I were obliged not to define poetry, but name the class of things to which it belongs, I should call it a secretion, whether a natural secretion, like turpentine in the fir, or a morbid secretion, like the pearl in the oyster. The oyster and the sea anemone both belong to a class of things that Eliot associates with the production of poetry: mental passivity, involuntary processes of selection, and the accumulation of value around seemingly worthless material. Here and elsewhere, marine life seems to provide confirmation for Eliot of the productiveness of the sensation of being bound to certain images, and of what the mind can make out of what it cannot let go. Perhaps the best way of understanding the feeling that attaches itself to Eliot's marine imagery is what Kevin Brazil, in an article on queer happiness, calls the good kind of clingy. A lingering on that which sticks us to things, a form in which the self is created by its openness to others. Brazil first experienced the sensation of good clinginess when he read the following seemingly illogical statement by the novelist Andrea Lawler. Quote, "I feel that every good thing that has happened in my life has come from being queer." Brazil knows that this cannot be true. Many of his loved ones, he notes, are gloriously, definitionally straight, and yet he feels it to be. "Maybe I was failing as a reader, a listener, a looker," he writes, but that line stuck with me. Brazil's distinction suggests that attending to the things that cling can reveal surprising and seemingly counterintuitive emotional truths. It is also useful for thinking about how the sensation of feeling attached to something can feel like a failure to read or interpret it critically, a feeling I must admit I have often experienced as I have grown more and more attached to Eliot's marine imagery. Eliot's reflections on the sea anemone likewise conveys a sense of being caught in the grip of an uncertain image and of feeling one's critical powers fail. And yet, like Brazil, he recognises the potential for this sense of intellectual powerlessness to give way to something powerfully affirming. By tracing the presence of Eliot's marine attachments from his early poems to his later works, we too may be gripped by the presence of something difficult to read, yet quietly compelling in its tenacity. And like Eliot, we may be struck by the feeling that our attachments run deeper than we know. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for this brilliant talk and incredibly rich that is going to generate a wonderful discussion, I think. But before that, let's hear the response of Olivier Hercend. So Olivier completed his PhD at Sorbonne Université in 2019 under the supervision of Professor Frédéric Regard on the relation to the reader in the works of T.S. Eliot, Virginia Woolf, and James Joyce. And he's currently working on the publication of his thesis with Classique Garnier. He has published several papers, including Le Modernisme et les dangers de la lecture in Études britanniques contemporaines in 2019, Virginia Woolf and the Police, Banality, Ideology, and the Scene of Interpolation in Textual Practice 2021, and The Agonistics of Reading, Playing, Gambling, Committing in Angles 2020. He also organized the conference The Wanderings of Modernism at Sorbonne Université in
co-organized
with myself at Sorbonne Université in 2020 and is the treasurer of the Société d'études modernistes, and he's currently working as a postdoctoral lecturer or à terre at Université Paris-Nanterre.
Thank you very much, Yasna, and thank you very much, Rachel, for coming on behalf of the Société d'études modernistes, which has had its share of COVID-related problems, but which is really happy to have you here in presence, and all of you, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to see you all. And, of course, it was a great pleasure to listen to you and to be caught by those claws and those ragged claws scuttling across the floors of silent seas, caught in a dialogue that spans through Eliot's life in this sort of submarine undercurrent. Very interesting to see how these images recur in a sort of very slight but always they are always connected, it seems, or at least very often connected with memory. I'm sure we'll talk about that. But before that, I was particularly interested in the way that you, of course, created these links with Eliot's own readings, with Eliot's own thoughts. And I was wondering, there were two things that came to my mind in that domain. The first one being that I know that Bergson talks a lot about evolutionary processes and talks about sea creatures in L'Évolution créatrice, possibly in essays and in classes that Eliot will have probably heard or read. And I was wondering if perhaps even the philosophy, the idea of the élan vital, has something to do with the oceanic feeling, which I feel they have some deeper, perhaps, attachments. And the other thing that perhaps came to me when you were talking about, so specifically, let me just make sure I remember, it was the seaweed, sorry, the sea anemone's world, which made me think about ethology, about all the questions of the animal's worlds and how the animal's biology can be considered as a way of relating to an environment.
Yes.
And I was wondering how Eliot saw that, perhaps also if he linked that with his own ideas taken from Bradley and taken from the spheres. So that was perhaps my more scientific, slightly geeky question, but there we are. Now, perhaps a wider question, which opens up the talk, would be that it seems, unless I am mistaken, that you have chosen to stay focused on the real marine creatures that Eliot talks about, when, of course, there are also quite a number of sea monsters, of mermaids, and of other fictitious creatures. And I was wondering how you linked these two kinds of occurrences, these fictitious sea creatures with the real sea creatures and the fictitious sea experiences, perhaps also. I'm thinking, for instance, in Dry Salvages, of the behavior of the sea monster. Also because perhaps one of the interesting things with these monsters is that they tend to be quite dangerous. They tend to be creatures that attract you to their den, that can drown you, and monsters that, have this sort of imposing behemoth quality I was thinking about. And perhaps that might be another question that goes along with it, because I talked about fictitious. Perhaps also there is an intertextual marine life. I'm thinking about Rimbaud's Bateau Ivre, Le Rut des Behemoths. All of these creatures, fictitious but intertextual, intertwine with the real creatures, and I was wondering how you saw those intersections. Going into, we were talking about the attractions of the mermaids, etc. It is, of course, certain that there is a very strong sense of clinginess, attachment. I was wondering how you wreathed this feeling of clinginess with another one, perhaps, of desire. Of course, in the Freudian vision of the oceanic feeling, there is also the idea that it is lost, and that then it creates a form of very complex desire, which is linked with the instinct of life, but also the instinct of death.
Yes.
And I was thinking about, of course, marine creatures and the relation to the sea in Eliot more broadly. And as a matter of fact, what came to me was the fishing in the wasteland. Of course, the Fisher King. I was sitting on the shore fishing round behind the gas house on a winter evening, musing about the king my brother's wreck, if I remember well. So there's also another idea coming. So the fishing, of course, is this idea of trying to get something from the sea, of a desire, but then there's the wreck. There's the possibility of breaking from this exploration of the sea, from this looking for something inside the sea. And I'm thinking also about Conversation Galante, where you have the moon being compared to a lantern hung aloft to, did I write it somewhere? To lead travelers to their distress. And so all these ideas of wreckages, of drowning, are, of course, extremely important. Yeah. And so this idea of desire, of a potentiality of, danger in this desire. You were talking about the crabs, and you said that there is some violence there. And I was wondering how this clinginess worked with the idea of desire. All the more so, perhaps, as another feature of the sea, dry salvages again, is we cannot think of an ocean not littered with wastage. And with desire on one side comes repulsion. On the other comes all of these ideas of Fleber's definition. The current washed his bones in whispers, etc., of these rotting corpses inside the sea. Which also, by the way, made me wonder about perhaps a side question, but still the relation between marine biology and marine, so to speak, mineralogy. Because, of course, the drowned Phoenician sailors, those are pearls that were his eyes. And you were talking about pearls, but pearls are minerals coming from the living. And I was wondering about these permutabilities, these chemical reactions between the living and the non-living, the mineral. Perhaps this also leads me, if I'm talking about the drowned Phoenician sailor, to the question, you talked about restoration, you talked about the fact that the sea undoes and restores, and I totally agree with you. I think that's something extremely important in Eliot, but perhaps it is also more general. I was thinking of the sea and the submarine life also as a modality of time, so to speak. Of course, Fleber's the Phoenician, a current in the sea washed his bones in whispers. As he rose and fell, he passed through the stages of his age and youth. So reversal, the idea that time goes the other way round, perhaps, in the sea, or at least that it is completely cyclical to the point that you go back to where you first came, is very important. And as a matter of fact, it reminded me of the chorus to Sophocles' Antigone, which I'm pretty sure Eliot had read, and which talks about the humankind as creating boats that create a linear path through the sea, which is itself always circular. So I was wondering about this submarine life and the sea in itself as a place where time can be different, a place where, of course, lingering, clinging, is also a modality of time. We have lingered in the chambers of the sea. Underwater, you linger. and you're also caught when you linger by seagulls wreathed with seaweed red and brown.
Yeah,
so there's something in there of a sort of time being woven in a different way. Lots of things to say. And a last one, perhaps, and just one, because I also want to open on the rest of your work. When I was thinking about underwater, it made me think that you were also working on insects. Yeah. And so I was wondering about the parallel, perhaps, between the underwater and the underground, where, of course, you have dried tubers. You have also rotting corpses. You have also another way to relate to nature. And I was wondering, you who seem to also be interested in the question of extinction, that is to say, also of the loss of insects, etc., if this relation to the earth as nutritional and to the sea as this very nutritional, this very motherly concept, how you articulated the two, perhaps.
Okay.
All right, I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Olivier. Wow, so much to think about there. So should I sort of respond point by point?
Oh, no, just...
Okay, just freestyle. Yeah. I mean, I've made some notes as you were speaking. And the Bergson point was very interesting, and I spent time looking into kind of what Eliot had encountered in Bergson. But I suppose I tended to stick more with instances where I could see evidence of Eliot engaging with a specific passage. So that hence why the Darwin annotation of the most securely held crabs really caught my eye, because it's, Eliot actually kind of underlining that and kind of making kind of marks and margins there. And equally with the McBride material, the fact that he's quoting that in an article and it's clearly something that he's read and engaged with, and then he's also sort of affirming his belief that this is the case in terms of this idea about, the sort of loss and atrophy of organs or features that are not being used. So I suppose I had quite a range of reading material to consult, because there's been some really good textual material on Eliot's reading of evolutionary biology. So it was trying to kind of drill down into that a little bit and find what felt like the most relevant to thinking about marine life. So I suppose the marine life came before the evolutionary biology, but the evolutionary biology felt like a really important context for understanding how Eliot was thinking about it, and also to explain why is he thinking about it, where are these images coming from other than his boyhood experiences. I think perhaps I should go back to the Bergson and the kind of marine imagery of creative evolution, because I looked at that text for my insect project and was very focused on his kind of the relationship between intelligence and instinct that's figured through images of insects. But there could be something fruitful there. And then what you say about this sort of ethology, I wanted to try and find out whether Eliot had read any of Jacob von Uexküll's kind of work on the Umwelt and the kind of life world of creatures, and I couldn't find any evidence of that, but it really struck me how his writing in the Bradley dissertation seems to be articulating something very similar to that, and equally he talks about jellyfish in that thesis as well.
Does he?
And so I thought, okay, so there's mentions of sea creatures, marine life in his dissertation. So is there any marine imagery in Bradley? And I couldn't find any, and so that made me think, okay, so this is Eliot's frame of reference for understanding a concept that he finds in Bradley, but he's the one who's bringing in the marine imagery, which again felt kind of significant to my thinking about him returning again and again to this sort of set of images. With the sea monsters and the kind of sea creatures question, I think I've made the conscious decision to actively steer away from images of marine monstrosity, and that's partly because I think part of what I'm trying to do with the wider project is to think about how we might think about marine life aside from ideas of monstrosity, which are very kind of prevalent in mainstream culture and going right back into kind of 19th century adventure fiction. When marine life forms are encountered, it is often in this kind of way, this sort of the kraken, the kind of
Jobs.
yes, exactly. Yeah. And I think part of the case I want to make is that what about the other ways of thinking about marine life forms that don't sort of press them into the service of this kind of sensational narrative that often seems to stem from ideas of kind of terror and excitement and then also neglects the more seemingly kind of uncharismatic organisms, the ones that don't have like giant grasping tentacles, or scary faces. So I think that's something that I will try and justify in the context of the wider project. But the examples that you gave there of the mermaids and the sea monsters really made me think that I need to kind of think about this idea of attachment and clinging in the context of this, because there is something going on there, and like you say about the connection with desire as well, and this kind of articulation of loss and desire in the context of the sea and submarine imagery. That definitely seems like something I need to return to. Eliot was actually good friends with a marine biologist called Geoffrey Tandy, who he became friends with him in the 1930s. He was a curator at the Natural History Museum in London, and Tandy would go off on these marine biology expeditions, including to the Great Barrier Reef, one of the first scientific expeditions there. And Eliot, in his letters, says, "Oh, you're off to fight the sea monsters," and things like that. So there was this kind of joking, kind of sort of seafaring kind of imagery that's running through their letters as well. And when you were speaking about temporality and this idea of the sea and the underwater realm in particular being a space of kind of disrupted or reversed temporality, it made me think of an essay by David Bradshaw on Woolf's The Voyage Out, where he talks about this sort of desire to kind of sink down to the submarine realm as like the desire to kind of sink out of patriarchy, out of patriarchal society, and into a kind of atemporal zone. So I think that is really relevant to Eliot's writing as well. Like, where are you going when you're imagining yourself being underwater? Like, what is it that you're fantasizing about leaving, and where are you fantasizing about arriving to as well? And that's still something that I'm thinking about in relation, just like the role of like fantasy element in generally in modernist writing and more contemporary writing. And oh yes, when you were talking about desire and repulsion and rotting corpses and the sea as a site of wasted. So I think my third chapter is going to be on Sylvia Plath, and I'm going to be thinking about the sea and marine life in the context of obscenity and the marine obscene. So I think
sounds like a great title.
Yeah, it's from a poem. I'll find the reference to the poem because that's where the phrase was suggested to me. So I think in some ways I'm kind of saving some of my thinking about that for Plath, but I think it will probably come back through into Eliot as well. And your final kind of point about insects and marine life. I mean, there are so many connections between the two projects. In some ways, too many connections, and it's taking me time to try and separate out the two projects. So I spent a long time thinking about form, and I feel like ideas of form are kind of travelling through into this project. But I'm increasingly trying to follow a kind of another line of argument that's coming out of this project, which seems to me to be about affect and affective relations. And I think that's what this Eliot material is taking me to, and that seems to be something that kind of distinguishes the insect modernist aesthetics project and the marine life modern contemporary project. But I do think there are some really obvious like connections between the two. I mean, the difference between, say, insects and crustaceans is very minor. They are kind of like crabs are just like insects in the water, aren't they? You know, in some respects. So I think there are some interesting parallels. But yeah, thank you. There's so much to think about in what you've said there, and